Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. And imagine leaving home and arriving on the platform of one of the greatest mass transit systems in the country. You wait a few minutes, a rail car or train arrives, and you're whisked to your destination. For a good chunk of the 20th century, rail cars took Detroiters from point A to point B. Along Gratiot and Grand River, people didn't own cars. For one, they were too expensive. But there was also no reason to have one because streetcars crisscrossed Detroit and even went out to places like Port Huron and Arbor. Here is Democratic Socialist of America Rep. Melina Herrera explaining the streetcar system to us on our show.
These big streets, they are laid out in spokes, kind of like a bicycle wheel. All those streets have streetcars on it. So yes, we're talking about Michigan Ave, we're talking about Woodward, we're talking about Gratiot, Jefferson. Everything had streetcars on it. In 1923, over 350 million rides were recorded on the streetcar system. And it even went into some of our suburbs. It went to Grosse Pointe, went to Royal Oak, all the way to Wyandotte.
Herrera is now working to bring streetcar tracks and streetcars back to Michigan Avenue. And that's because despite all its thrill and surplus funding, Detroit's rail system was dismantled. Many speculate the cause came from the automobile companies. We are the Motor City, after all. And others say it was because of the creation of the suburbs and the sprawl, which added to much cost onto the system.
Tia, we're going to get to the actual answer in the next segment. But we know that public transit looked really different in 1919 than it did in, say, 2020. Today, new cars are really expensive. Car insurance is very costly. And yet, public transit is worse today than it was 100 years ago. And so this hour, we want to know, what would convince you to take public transit in Detroit? How fast, how convenient do the buses or the Q line or some kind of rail system need to be for you to take it? The number is 313-577-1019. Before taking your calls, we want to reflect a bit on our own experiences taking public transit around Metro Detroit and beyond. And to discuss that now, we have a transit enthusiast and producer of this particular segment, Sam Corey, here with us. Sam, welcome to the Metro.
Hey, thanks, Robin. Glad to be here.
Sam, what's your experience been like taking public transit? Why are you a diehard transit person?
A huge diehard transit person. So I've taken the buses around here a bit. I've taken the Q line more recently because I started biking into work last summer, which was an interesting ride, one could say. But my big experience on public transit wasn't here. It was abroad. I lived in Vietnam for about a year. I was teaching English. And so I had the opportunity to go to other Asian countries nearby. And Japan, Taiwan, their train systems are amazing. I mean, it's incredible. You get off the airport, you get out of the airport, and you go straight to your destination by train. And then you go to a whole bunch of other places that you want to travel to by train. The mountains, the beaches, seeing friends. It just, it changes the way you look at sort of getting around and honestly how you organize your day.
Sam, so, okay, this rearranged your ideas of what life can be like according to public transit and the ways that you can navigate a city or even an entire country just with using public transit. Tia Graham, what about you? I realize you come from a car family, so has that kind of put transit sort of on the back shelf for you?
That is the unfortunate truth. I'm not going to say unfortunate truth because the auto industry here helped put me through school. So shout out to that. But I will say that, you know, growing up with folks who worked in the factories for 30 plus years, seeing the new cars and having the discounts to get new cars and all those things that come along with it, it just really built this idea within our family. But it's not just our family, but Detroit's culture, car culture of having and owning a vehicle and being taking pride in owning that car, whether it is to trick it out per se or make it look a certain way or just having this pride in owning a vehicle. It really is instilled in Detroiters or folks who grew up in this area. So I think just being a child of this area, being a child of those who worked in factories, having a vehicle and having a car, something really cool and prideful about it. But Detroit is also one of those cities that doesn't have a built-out public transit system. So growing up not having it actively in your face every single day is not something that you just think about or think about using.
What was your first car?
Hello Kitty.
Oh.
That was her nickname.
Her nickname is special collector's edition. No one's heard of.
Exactly. This is an inside
It's like,
for inside
learning
folk. But
new
no, my
things.
first car was a 2001 Ford Escape. Hello Kitty. And I had Hello Kitty for like 12 years, and she was the best car in the world. And I cried when I had to get rid of her.
Ooh,
yeah,
that's a
I
lot.
did. I was attached to that vehicle, but it took me through college and life and high school. So it was just, it was really personal to me. So when I think about cars and I think about public transit, especially in Detroit, we have such a unique attachment to cars that we have to find a way to blend both loves, both worlds, because you can't just get rid of Dream Cruise idea. You know, I just think about those two
Car
worlds.
culture's peer.
We have to figure out a way to balance both. So make public transit more accessible, easier for folks to use, but also let's still give some love to those who love their cars. I mean, we love our cars.
Robin, public transit, your experiences, what say you?
I mean, similar to you, I have been really amazed, Sam, with the public transit systems that I've experienced in other countries. In Japan, in South Korea, they were fast, they were efficient. You could get around the entire country. I experienced the same thing in Europe, going from like Paris to Amsterdam, how cool that was and how relaxing it was. And I also experienced it in some American cities on a smaller scale. Living in Denver, the light rail system there will get you right from the airport to the downtown area to a lot of the suburbs. Same thing with Denver's neighbor, Salt Lake City. And the ride was relaxing and it was efficient. And you know, something that we have been hearing from other Detroiters, we asked this question on Detroit's Reddit channel, what people think the future of Detroit transit should look like. And quite a few people said we need to start with a light rail connection that connects DTW with the city and the suburbs. And
that's so spicy.
Yeah,
wow, that's so
yeah.
spicy.
So that's, we have to... Is that the place to start? That is a question that we have here. Actually, I want to read what one of the folks who posted on Reddit in response to our question said. They said, a light rail connecting the suburbs to downtown and other cities. My dream is a light rail system running the entire stretch of Woodward that I can bike to from my home in Southfield, hop on, and be in Detroit in a timely manner. I know there's no way around getting it to be faster than driving downtown, but that's the thing. I don't want to drive downtown and deal with the parking.
That's why I rarely go, and I live near downtown. Rarely go. I live near downtown. It's just nowhere to park. Nowhere to park. So shout out to that Redditor there. Nowhere to park. What are we going to do about that? And I just think about just connecting the suburbs to Detroit. We know a lot of times, we've seen it on ballots. We've seen people pushing for it. We've seen initiatives. We've seen community groups come out for it. So it's just like, how do we bridge that? How do we get that conversation started, especially with the suburbs? Like, hey, these are cool things that we could really bring and help connect our communities.
Yeah, and Tia, I think like that was one of the biggest things that I learned from doing the research for this hour was how important this region is together. There's kind of like two important big ideas. One is that oftentimes the region, and particularly the suburbs, have been against a comprehensive regional transit plan. And one of our ideological cores here on the show is the metro. We believe in sort of a non-zero sum gain for both the city and the region. And I think transit sits at the center of that. But the second thing is this place that we have some of the really bad public transit right now, it used to be the best. And so we know that things can change. They aren't static. And so who knows what the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years will be depending on, what we do today, tomorrow, and the next day.
And just, Sam, before we let you go, because you did so much research for this hour, other than some of the things that you already knew, of course, about public transit here in the city of Detroit, what really stood out to you as something that was just like, oh my gosh, I did not know this?
Well, I just think the fact that, as a region, in 2016, we tried to pass a millage, right, a comprehensive transit millage. And it didn't pass. It didn't pass by 8,000 votes. But we had tried to do that as a region 28 times since 1967. So we have tried and tried and tried.
How many times?
28. And it doesn't mean it's going to fail the next time, but it does mean that the thing that stopped us is this sort of divide. And so we gotta overcome that. We
shall overcome.
Coming up, we're going to dive into the history of Detroit's once great streetcar system that we have just been talking about and what it would look like to build something like it again. And we want to hear from you. What would convince you to take public transit? How fast does it need to be? How convenient? The number is 313-577-1019. This is The Metro on WDET. Stay with us.
On 1019 WDET FM, I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. Today, if you're looking to get around by public transit, there are a few options. The 1970s subway plan Coleman Young tried to enact became the 3-mile people mover. There's also the Q line, which is something, but it's not very quick and it doesn't stretch beyond New Center, as was originally planned. What's more, the suburbs, the city of Detroit, and even some city suburbs have different bus systems. There's not one public transit system here in Detroit. There are several, and none are that great. So how did we become so fragmented here?
Robin, there was a time when Detroit's public transit system was unified and convenient. At the turn of the 20th century, Metro Detroit had one of the largest mass transit systems in the United States. Detroit's Department of Street Railways operated hundreds of buses and over 900 streetcars on 20 routes throughout the main spokes of the city. Why don't we still have it? And what would it take to bring something like that back to the city? To discuss all that, we have Robert Pfaff here. He's a professor of community and regional planning at Iowa State University, and he wrote his dissertation at the University of Michigan about the history of Detroit's streetcar system. Professor Pfaff, welcome to the Metro.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to be here.
Of course. And truly, before we jump right into things, why did you decide to get into streetcars, especially, what did you find out there in the world as you were sifting through and said, a Detroit streetcar?
I was doing my master's at Wayne State in history at the time that they were proposing to build the new Q line, so right around the early 2010s. And I remember thinking, what happened to all the old streetcars that used to be here? We go into the history of what used to be here and why are we building something new? What even happened? How did it get dismantled? And that initial small research paper question turned into 15 years of my life's work. It's crazy to think about.
Beautiful. So before getting into Detroit streetcar system, I want to talk a little bit about your personal journey. You studied Detroit's public transit system from the 1920s to the 1970s, and that was part because you grew up in Detroit and you were a teacher on the East Side's Marcus Garvey Academy. Okay, so talk a little bit about, of course, that growing up in Detroit a little bit.
Oh, man. So I worked at Marcus Garvey Academy as a student teacher. I never became a fully fledged teacher, I have to be very clear, but I commuted every single day, and I remember talking to my students, and I remember seeing the difficulties that they had just getting to school at Van Dyke and Werner, and I remember just wondering about elements of the built environment. At the time, I wanted to be a high school history teacher, and I eventually stumbled into urban and regional planning and transportation focus and transportation studies to really tackle the equity questions of how residents can gain access to places around the built environment, right? Thinking of schools, thinking of workplaces, thinking of education, and healthcare facilities. All of this is something that got wrapped up because I observed it in the actual 8th grade students that I was working with at Marcus Garvey.
And I'm in that intersection often. So, yeah. Okay, so what, I'm thinking about streetcars, of course. How good was the streetcar system in Detroit, and how did it compare with other cities like it at the time, especially when we talk about that early 1920s onwards? You know, what did it look like compared to a San Francisco at that time?
I mean, I think it's really interesting to take yourself back and sort of do this little historical imaginary to when you can be standing on Woodward and it's a more narrow street and there's, you know, you look down the street in any direction and you can see streetcars like lined up at like intersections down the road. Now we have the Q line and you have to wait a long time for the Q line to show up. You could walk up to a major intersection and expect to have a ride within 5 minutes if you were working at peak time, sometimes even faster. Off-peak hours, maybe waits maybe up to like 10 minutes. And that's even unheard of for really frequent bus systems, even around the country in modern day times. And that's just crazy to think that that has changed so much. And just in terms of where you could go was anywhere in the city. There were hundreds of millions of people that rode every single year. And we slowly began to dismantle the system from the 1930s to the 1970s.
And in just thinking about that early streetcar, it went places like Ann Arbor and Port Huron, sometimes reaching speeds up to 40 or 50 miles per hour. Now, this, once again, if you get in a time machine and you're thinking about this and comparing our time today versus then, it's like, how was this technology even so accessible?
Right? Like the electric traction motors that were used for regional rail that got you all the way out what they called the inner city connection. So, right, it took you out to Ann Arbor, took you out to Pontiac. It could take you out to Port Huron. It could take you as far south as Toledo and Cleveland. Would go up to 45 or 50 miles an hour. And those same streetcars could operate in the downtown system. Technically, they were owned by different agencies, so you had to transfer once you got into the city. But, that framework was there for inner city connections. And a lot of it eventually, that far out inner city connection to places like Ann Arbor or Toledo got bought up and is now freight rail track. But within the city, our streetcar connections enabled residents all around, and you could connect to many wider destinations, including across the metropolitan region.
I was just thinking putting ourselves in today and having the system staying intact. Today, I can think about kids being commuter students to University of Michigan easily or Eastern Michigan because they could easily get there and stay at home with their parents. It's just so many implications. We can go so deep into this. I know you do because you had a dissertation on it. So, what went wrong? We moved away from the streetcar. In your dissertation, you write that despite being the automotive capital of the world, Detroit's public transportation system was not liked by the automobile or the collusion of the automotive companies. What then killed the streetcar?
This is the $1 million question, right? And it's really two main things. First is generally the lack of regional cooperations. The streetcar started to decline around 1945, just after the wartime period. And as a result of that, people were thinking about trying to get out into the wider region, and they had no ability to connect in the wider region. You couldn't necessarily extend the streetcars very cost efficiently, and they tried to use buses to do it. And the other major barrier to that was, unfortunately, racism. Detroit was becoming a larger, blacker city, and the white residents were starting to take part in the suburban white flight. And that black-white racial divide has formed the backbone and the framework to a lot of the public transit debates and issues that we see in the modern day.
There's so many nuances and so many other things that were happening around the death of the streetcar. And just hearing you talk about 1945 and the war, how much did the war play a part in it?
Not necessarily immediately in the death of the streetcar. Rather, the war actually saw this enormous surge in ridership.
Nice.
I think there was a fear, like other streetcar companies across the country, that Detroit's streetcar would die sometime in the 1930s as a result of the Great Depression. And actually, the war kind of revived the streetcar. And because we were the arsenal of democracy, right? We were building more planes in a day than Germany could produce in a month. We had hundreds of thousands of workers going into factories all across the country. Ridership on the streetcars was surging to the point that they couldn't even get enough streetcars on the road to accommodate that. Some of those streetcars actually had coal-burning fireplaces. So they left the war in 1945 with this notion of, we have so much money, what are we going to spend it on to sort of take into the next chapter? And they decided on buses instead of into a continued streetcar investment. And that was a sort of like critical inflection point where they promised a lot but did not actually deliver.
I was going to say, I could only imagine being around in 1945, watching it all kind of just slowly decrease and go away and just watch it dissipate. That would have been, it's just sad hear you talk about it now. But let's talk about the automotive company's role more closely. It's widely believed that the National City Lines undercut public transit in Detroit. Essentially, they, on behalf of GM and others, conspired to monopolize the sales of buses, which led to the downfall of Detroit streetcars. National City Lines was actually found guilty of monopoly. So why are people who say that National City Lines killed the streetcar system wrong?
So this is a really fascinating history, right? NCL, or National City Lines, operated in other cities across the country. Actually, the really famous story of Rosa Parks in Montgomery, right? She was on a National City Lines bus. It currently sits in the Ford Museum down the street. And, you know, this happened in other cities across the country, but they were smaller cities. And those cities critically had, or rather did not have, ownership of their actual streetcar system. Detroit had a publicly owned streetcar system. The city bought it out in 1922 to operate it itself more efficiently, and that automatically prevented and held out other private investors from trying to come in and disrupt that space. And because of that, you know, we are the ones to blame for dismantling that system. We don't have some private company that came in and swept in with some grand scheme. We have to look inwardly at ourselves and question what we have as public service and public values and why we were defunding such a large system like that. And when you ask the question in that way and you don't have this notion that there was some magical arch enemy like GM that was working behind the scenes to tweak all the puppet strings, you get a very different story about what actually happened.
Yeah. Professor Pfaff, you say the streetcar died because suburban mayors and officials didn't want it, but Detroit could have kept it for its residents, just like you said. You know, and I know they wanted to build out that bus system, and they chose the bus system over the streetcar system. But can you talk to us a little bit about, you know, why Detroit didn't keep that streetcar for itself, even though it didn't get buy-in from the newfound inner ring suburbs?
Yeah, that's another fascinating question. So right around 1936 or 37, they actually started to buy new streetcars, and they started to think to themselves, we have to begin to build a more modern streetcar fleet. And somewhat lack of a better word, right, there was a vibe shift for the Detroit residents that began to think, oh, streetcars aren't actually this super modern thing. The super modern thing are these nice, quiet, fast, rubber-tired diesel buses that operate on the streets. And so the city was kind of doing a dual strategy where they were investing a little bit in the streetcar fleet and then also investing in an increase in the bus fleet. And they continued that all the way up to 1945, and then they hit that kind of like inflection point. And they started to decide, if we're going to serve the modern region, we have to see, or we're identifying population trends that show people moving into slightly lower density, more suburban residential areas. And in order to provide service to them, we can't do electrification, we can't do tracks. The easy way to do it is with buses. And so the city said, the better way to provide service into the new expanding metro region is through buses. And they identified that that was the sort of like transit future, and they began to build towards that. And you would hope or think that streetcars would kind of be the downtown core or the backbone of the system, and that didn't actually materialize. You asked the question earlier about how our system compared to other systems around the country. Other systems around the country maintain that sort of, you know, rail backbone, even if it's like Chicago with elevated rail, or New York City with famous subways, or Boston, or even DC with Ramada. They maintain the central core, and it's served by outer buses that feed the central core. We demolished our central core with the assumption that buses could go everywhere, and then that vision never really materialized.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. We're talking about the history of Detroit's streetcar system and why Detroit's public transit system is so fragmented. Our guest is Robert Pfaff. He's a professor of community and regional planning at Iowa State University, and he wrote his dissertation at University of Michigan about the history of Detroit's streetcar system. And we want to hear from you. What would convince you to take public transit in Detroit and the suburbs? The number is 313-577-1019. Let's go to the phones. We have some callers who've been patiently waiting. Joseph in Detroit, thank you for your patience. What would convince you to take public transit in the city?
Easy. Make it run for longer than a mile.
That's fair, Joseph. I think that I think you're echoing some of the feelings that many of us have, and I think that many of us had hoped that could have been the case with the Q line. We're going to go to Christina, who's also from Detroit. Christina, thanks for calling the Metro.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead. What are your thoughts on public transit in Detroit?
So I think my thoughts might be a little bit different than what I've heard the last probably like 6 to 7 minutes. I'm actually a car-free mom in Detroit. Due to the infrastructure in 2021, the flood, I watched my car float down Trumbull, where I lived, and I decided after receiving a check from the car insurance company that because of my location, that I was going to see if I could go car-free. The goal was for a year. That was 2021, June 26th. I am officially still car-free in the D. And I take public transit. I take it to my clients. I'm also an entrepreneur who homeschools my child who's on the spectrum. And I mean, I talk about it on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, and Detroit's transportation isn't Chicago, but Detroit isn't Chicago. Detroit's transportation isn't New York. We don't have the population or even the percentage of the population. We're not New York. I believe in the last 4 years, it's getting better. Is it the greatest thing in the world? The greatest thing since like white sliced bread? No. But I also think that there's strides, especially with Kramer involved, coming from Detroit, people over to DDOT, that there'll be a lot of changes. And it's not the worst thing. And my goal in like social media is to help people see like you can do a lot of things and live a life car free. Again, I also go into that with like being able to effectively plan. If you have to be at work at 8 a.m. and you know that you have to take, unfortunately, 2 buses to get there, maybe we're not, leaving our house at 7:05 because, the next bus is scheduled at 7:15 and then the next one after that at 7:45. Maybe we have to do the 6:35 for right now until something else gets better. But by all means, I'm not saying to like stop griping on the system. Because no, it's not the greatest thing in the world. But
well, Christina, you're saying though it's something. I'm sorry to cut you off there, but it's something that folks do have to make a concerted effort to participate in this transit system.
Absolutely. Like I have a friend who, if anyone follows me on Instagram,
tell us your account.
Socially Chrissy is on all accounts.
Perfect. Go on.
And recently, so the newest nuance of my life is that I am obviously car free, but I now have an e-bike for the last few months. And I'm now impacting so many people to show how I use, I have a cargo style, obviously, so my daughter can still be on it, and I have a traditional style, and showing people, people didn't know that you could put a cargo bike on a bus. You can, there is a weight limit, but you can. And the one that I have is able to go on a bus. And so that helps me with the last mile. So one of my clients is Good Cakes and Bakes. I'm able to go from downtown Detroit, where I live. I take the Woodward Fast, but Good Cakes and Bakes is on Livernois and 7 Mile. Instead of having to correlate those 2 buses for that last mile, I'm able to take my bike that is on the bus and bike that last, I think it takes me 8 minutes to get to the bakery. You just have to utilize and put things together. And again, I want to emphasize, not everyone may have the access or the finances to e-bike. I understand that, but you can have a traditional bike, but also that there are other alternatives to the bus system and using what we have to get to where we need to go and how we need to get there until it is effectively changed for the better and better. And again, I think, we are making strides to be better, and it's not great, but I also am the person who's like, it's not the worst either.
It's not the best and it's not the worst. That is fair. Christina, thank you so much for calling into the Metro. Let's get back to the history, if we could, Professor Pfaff, explaining how we got here to this place of limbo, of transit limbo, where it's not the best and it's not the worst. So you say that automotive companies didn't kill the Detroit streetcar or great bus public transit, but they didn't seem to help rail either.
Not in the conventional way that we know it. And I'm actually really grateful that the caller called in because it points out to this sort of like notion that transit dependency used to be a much greater percentage of the Detroit households. Currently, 20% of Detroit households are car free. But back in the 1950s, there was a major strike on the transit railways where the buses simply didn't run, the streetcars didn't run, and people were standing at the corner waiting for the ride. And, it went on for, I think, something like 60 or so days, and people just couldn't simply get around because they had come to rely on that transit system. And this did not just originate out of the blue, but we were thinking about union relations, we're thinking about costs, we're thinking about how much it actually takes for the city to maintain a system with hundreds of millions of riders per year serving every single corner of the metropolitan area. And there's also a sort of misconception that public companies like Ford or GM hated public transit. Ford actually bailed out part of the initial streetcar system in 1921 and actually provided, because they recognized that this was the way that most of their workers actually got to work. It provided a higher frequency and a higher capacity to reach manufacturing destinations in places like Highland Park or out in Dearborn. The critical thing is that city officials, mayors, people like the vehement and voracious racist Orville Hubbard didn't actually like the transit to go any further into Dearborn. They was happy to take transit to the River Rouge, but not into or any further into part of the city of Dearborn. And so there's that sort of misconception that has to be, I think, slightly addressed, that these companies hated it because in some cases they actually advocated for it. And when Ford built the Willow Run plant out in Ypsilanti, they initially tried to get a streetcar built out there too, to build the B-25 bombers. And it ended up being a bus line, but they promoted mass transit for these things.
Okay, so anti-Black racial animus and segregation helped kill the streetcar. But Chicago had a lot of racial violence and segregation, and its public transit systems are much better than ours today. Why was Detroit's situation unique in this way?
That is a fascinating question, right? Detroit is, and I want to say it still is, I'd have to triple check the demographics, the largest, blackest city in the United States, but we were killing the streetcar before we became the largest, blackest city in the United States. We were killing the streetcar in that kind of period of racial transition, of white flight into the suburban areas. Chicago has, while they also have a rail-based legacy, what they call a legacy rail system, that legacy rail system has something like dedicated right-of-way and grade separation. They operate in the elevated parts of the system outside the city, or if you're inside the loop, you're downtown, underground, in a kind of subway configuration. All of Detroit's streetcars were what are called at grade. They were on the street. And if you look, there's actually YouTube videos that you can find of old film reels of the city in the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s. And you can see streetcars getting cut off by random new Model Ts and other random cars on the road because they were just operating in the middle of the roadway. Residents that wanted to ride them had to walk across lanes of vehicle travel to stand in the middle of the road. But the streetcars had a sort of infrastructure that was built back in the 1880s. And so the tracks that were there were initially around horse-drawn carriages on a cobblestone street. They weren't expecting people to go 25, 30, 45 miles an hour in a private automobile next to where they're trying to board for public transportation. And so there was this kind of growing pain that the system faced as we started to become an increasing automobile capital. Not just from the 1920s, right? We saw this in the 30s, we saw it in the 40s, we saw it in the 50s. And this happened slowly and gradually over time. There wasn't really this light switch moment where that changed. But when we defunded that center system, we lost the ability to do kind of what Chicago has with a higher capacity frequent rail downtown core. Now we have to reinvest in some type of heavy infrastructure to be able to make that possible again.
Let's stay on the topic of infrastructure if we could. People say that sprawl killed public transit here. And they say that being really spread out makes it difficult to do public transit well because the cost of doing it well goes up because ridership goes down. So we're thinking about, how far the suburbs of Detroit stretch. Why are they wrong about sprawl killing rail or solid public bus transit in Detroit?
Right. We could and we can imagine the possibility of high frequency that allows for people to be able to reach their critical destinations. And if you have the ability of frequency and reliability and the possibility of making necessary connections, hopefully not too many connections, you can get to your destination effectively. And then you can also, I think, like Christina mentioned, be one of the people that can live car free. You have to do it with a lot of planning, but you can do it. But it requires funding and it requires infrastructure and it requires investment. And like very critically, I think something that not a lot of people know about in this sort of like weird world around transportation planning is that nowadays these systems don't actually pay for themselves. And what's called fare box revenue capture, the amount of the actual total operating budget that comes from the actual riders, the actual tickets that you pay when you get on board, that money only covers somewhere between 15 and 20% on average, even for the largest systems. There are now federal operating subsidies. There are now city and state operating subsidies that have to fill in the gaps. But we also have to think about what are we doing in terms of providing a public service for our residents who are using these facilities. Are they better for the climate? Are we reducing total vehicle emissions? And is this actually going to be safer in the long term by reducing something like pedestrian fatalities and crashes and lowering insurance rates and lowering costs, right? It's an ecosystem, and it is very much a woven tapestry where all these things have to come together. There's no single right answer, and there's no single, again, sort of like light switch element.
Professor Pfaff, we're going to get back to the phones in a moment, but you just mentioned federal subsidies, so I do have to ask, do you feel that building a rail system is even an option under the Trump administration? I imagine it would take quite a bit of federal funding, and the Trump administration is anticipated to implement budget cuts that could significantly affect various passenger rail initiatives and other public transit initiatives.
Yeah, this is something that's pretty fascinating, right? Because I think there's this notion that public transportation as a public good can only ever really like serve the people. And there's lists of words that you can't say in certain financing grants now. But a critical component of this is that the streetcar funding that came for the Q line was actually economic development money. And that's this notion, and I think we've actually seen it along the Q line corridor. I mean, I have my problems with the Q line. We had the first caller that said we want a system that goes more than a mile. I absolutely agree. We wanted it to go longer. But, you know, the money from this actually has spurred economic growth around the corridor, and that's what it was designed to do. And there's many famous researchers that have talked about how this was an economic development tool, and it had benefited people like Dan Gilbert. It had benefited along the actual corridor of the Q line with different residential growth and et cetera. But if you frame it and if we go into policy discussions talking about the economic benefits of transportation and not necessarily, you know, other types of arguments, you can usually make a very effective cost argument for why building transit infrastructure results in investment for the entire community and the entire region.
Let's go to the phones now to hear from Trevor in Southfield. What would convince you, Trevor, to take the city's public transit?
So coming from Southfield, just making it more accessible and user-friendly. I know we have the bus systems around here, but they're just kind of complicated to navigate and figure out how they work has been my big dilemma.
That's fair. I'm sure that you are echoing how a lot of folks feel just figuring out how to navigate transit systems. Professor Pfaff, can you speak to that and how that makes transit inaccessible to people?
Yeah, right. At the top of the hour, I think you guys did a great job in the introduction thinking about the fragmentation of our transportation system. I also think it's like really emblematic in the struggle that James Robertson had as the so-called walking man from 2014 and 2015 when he had his kind of big media moment in the free press, because his struggle was transferring from DDOT into SMART. And if you think about the larger region, we have multiple different separate transit agencies. Obviously, the Q line just got picked up recently by the RTA, but it used to be separate. You have the People Mover, you have SMART, the Suburban Metropolitan Area Regional, I might be messing up the acronym slightly, transportation, and you obviously have the DDOT buses as well. And so all of these have to come together in that kind of like transportation tapestry to get people out into the region. And that's where going back to the history is actually really instructive, because we can see the sort of like direct points at which we began to fail to serve the region with a cohesive transportation system. And I think we tried in 2016 with the RTA proposal to build a more cohesive transit system that would provide that level of connectivity for all the different metropolitan regions, all the different cities, all the different neighborhoods. But it ultimately, as we know, didn't pass. And so we have to think about what it takes to get back to that cohesive network and avoid some of this fragmentation between thinking, oh, I have to take SMART here, and then I have to go transfer to DDOT, and then I'll transfer to the Q line, or then I'll go to the People Mover, et cetera.
Robert Pfaff is a professor of community and regional planning at Iowa State University. He wrote his dissertation at University of Michigan about the history of Detroit's streetcar system. Professor Pfaff, thank you for joining us on the Metro.
It's my pleasure. Thank you all for having me.
Coming up on the Metro, we'll discuss the latest news on our public transit options in Detroit. What is getting more funding? Will the buses be sped up at all? We'll get to that, and we also want to hear from you. What would convince you to take public transit, and how fast does it need to be? How convenient. The number is 313-577-1019. Stay with us on the Metro. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Metro on 1019 WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. Detroit's public transit systems aren't up to par. Not enough people take them because they're not fast or convenient enough. But just because that's true now doesn't mean it always will be. There are a number of people working to reduce wait times and speed up routes.
That's right. One of those people is Robert Kramer. He's Detroit's Department of Transportation Director, and he's back on the Metro to discuss what his department is doing to improve the quality and quantity of bus ridership. Director Kramer, welcome back to the Metro.
I am thrilled to be back. Nice to see you all again.
Yes, not 3 weeks into, or like a few days into your role, so you have a little bit underneath you now. But Director Kramer, we had you on the show back in January when you just became the director of DDOT, and I know that you've long worked in public transit. You worked with the People Mover, but I'm wondering, since we've had you on, what surprised you most about being director for the transit department?
Well, it's a great question. Thinking back, I think that it was probably my third day, I think, that I was in here, and I had already come across a lot of people at DDOT and really all the city departments that take a lot of pride in what they do. And so I don't know if it's surprising, but that definitely has continued. And even just some of the progress that we've made internally and really focusing on service delivery, reliability, and improving the customer experience has just been it's all people who do that stuff, right? And so that's been a pleasant surprise, or as I had hoped would happen so far.
It's nice to have a pleasant surprise at work.
Yeah.
So there are a number of issues that you're working on. There are a lot of bus stops without shelters and late and unreliable buses. And there are simply concerns over the safety of the drivers, the riders, the pedestrians. I know that's particularly one of the reasons I think about when I'm thinking about public transit is safety. So you're proposing a budget for 2025, 2026 of around $220 million. And here's Mayor Duggan speaking about that budget last night.
Also proposing a $20 million increase in funding for DDOT, adding 45 buses, 63 new drivers, 24 new mechanics, increasing the daily buses from 178 to 220, the most in years.
And just if you can't get all of the funding you seek and need to make some of those tough choices, what is your top priority for the budget?
Well, the budget, the priorities, regardless of how much service you have on the road, are going to be safe service, reliable service, and a positive customer experience. So those are things you can apply whether you have one bus that's out on the road or if we get up to having 220 pulling out every afternoon. So those are the things that we're going to be stressing. And that's as we present that budget. Those are the things we're really looking for, where we can make those investments. So you talked about shelters. The budget talks about how do we add more shelters? How do we make sure that our equipment on the buses, our technology is up to date so that we can make sure that we're creating a safe environment for the drivers and the passengers? All those things are woven into the budget. The increase is really about making sure we can continue to build on those, but also to increase the drivers so that we have more service on the road as well. So it's kind of, walking and chewing gum at the same time.
At the same time. So this is some of the things that we could see if the budget is approved. We'll see some of those type of things being distributed out throughout the bus services.
Yeah, what we're aiming for is to increase service by at least 10 to 15% over the course of the budget year if we get there. We have a service increase coming up April 21st. It's about 5% increase. We just had hearings last week about another increase in June. So about every quarter is what we're aiming at we are going to make sure as we go through each of those steps, we have enough drivers and buses, because we don't want to put more service out on the street than we can deliver, because then the reliability and the safety and the experience start to go down. So we're really being very intentional about what we're putting in place that allows us to maintain those standards and make the progress we want to.
And we want to stay here with the bus shelters just for a little bit, because only one out of every 20 Detroit bus stops does have a shelter, according to city data. And DDOT does plan to add an additional 250 shelters between 2024, last year, and 2027. So how many total shelters do you want to get put up by next year?
I think we've got 60 that are kind of in the works right now. The next phase is a little bit over 100. So the goal is to be able to get through all of those by the end of next fiscal year. So, in the next 15 months or so. And I know, I think about half of those, if I remember correctly, half of them are replacing and upgrading older shelters that may have been damaged or beyond their useful life. And others are adding that amenity where there hasn't been one before.
And let's get into something really interesting happening along the East Jefferson corridor. The area is getting enhanced boarding platforms at 21 bus stops. What's different about these particular platforms, and how will they improve the rider experience?
Yeah, so this corridor, East Jefferson, is an enhanced corridor, and so it's both the amenities and the service. The service is already there. It's up to only 10 minutes between buses, and that has been in place, and we've already seen positive feedback from that. Now it's about matching that with the infrastructure. So what it means is that you'll have new or upgraded shelters. There's designs in there that have small signs that actually show when the next bus is arriving, kind of like tablet-sized signs. Smart has some on some of their stops now. And then the boarding platform it's like a resin, plastic, epoxy sort of platform is the best way to put it, that goes from the curb out to meet the bus in the travel lane. And Jefferson, of course, has bike lanes throughout, so it's designed in a way that the bikes can actually ride over it. But once you cross that bike lane, pass through lane, there's spot to wait for the bus and board, and that really speeds up how long it takes to load people on and off the bus, and lets the bus stay in traffic so that it's not taking that extra time to get back out into a travel lane. So it's improving the experience from what's there when you're waiting, but also helps the route work that much more efficiently also.
And let's go back to the phone lines. We have Megan Owens of Transit Riders United. Megan, what question do you have for Director Kramer?
Hi, Robert. I really applaud the efforts that DDOT's been making to, under Director Kramer, to really improve the service and really move towards the point where everyone in the city can be close by a bus route that runs like every 10 minutes. So that's one of the things people loved about the streetcars, was just how frequent they were. And I think the buses can do the same. I did want to ask, I know that in addition to the city budget, an important portion of DDOT's funding comes from the state and even the federal government, and that state funding has been declining over years. Can you say a little bit about where DDOT comes up with the revenue to provide all of this critical service?
Yeah, and hello, Megan. So there's a lot of different factors that play into the funding picture for DDOT and also for SMART and all of our operating partners. The state's certainly part of it. Our goal really is not to not answer the question, but our goal is we're going to do the best we can with the funding that we have, whether it's council or state. So certainly the decrease in funding available, or the reimbursement rate from the state, is an issue that I know is a problem for all the providers across the state, really. But that's why it's even more important that we're seeing this budget that the mayor has proposed to the council and that they've been very receptive about so far, that allows us to increase our funding, kind of takes some of the pressure off. We don't have to worry as much about cuts when overall as an agency we're continuing to have that growth and additional funding. So we're very excited and grateful for that, and hopefully more funding from the state would be even better. But we'll continue to do what we can with what we're able to get.
Megan, I want to say thank you for giving us a call. Megan Owens of Transit Riders United. And as well, just really quickly, 30 seconds or less, what are your hopes, especially in the role as director of DDOT, as we go forward, even just in the next year or so, with improvements to the ridership?
Yeah, I really think just overall looking for making the employees continue to have something to be proud about across the city, and just continuing to rebuild the trust and seeing more and more people see this as a convenient and attractive option to get around the city.
Detroit's director of transportation, Robert Kramer, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro and coming back to the Metro. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
The Metro is produced by Sam Corey, Carrie Jr. II, and Jack Philbrandt. Our engineer is Nate Bender. Our senior producer is David Lyons. This is WDET FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation.